Okay, that's good. I am Tim Young. I am a mastering engineer here at Metropolis Studios in London. I've worked here since 1993, and previous to that I worked for what was originally CBS Records, which then became Sony Music, and I worked there from 1976 to 1993, and during that time I learnt how to cut vinyl, and I became a vinyl cutting engineer, which transitioned into the CD age in the 1980s. And then before that, when I left school between 1971 and 1976, I used to work for a subsidiary company of Trident Studios, which is a very, very famous London studio in those days, in the early 70s. And that was my first job, doing the mastering for the duplication of cassettes and 8-track cartridges. The main objectives of a mastering engineer, as far as I'm concerned, not everyone would automatically agree with this, is that you are an objective ear, I suppose. If you're experienced and confident in what you're saying and confident in what you're thinking about your client's music, you can make suggestions to them. For instance, I did an album recently where one of the tracks ended peculiarly, and it was much better with a fade out than a proper cold end on the track. There may be a mistake in the running order in their album, so I feel it's my job to point that out. Obviously, you know, it's up to them if they want to change it, and these are all basic things I think that is your job as a mastering engineer. And this is even before you've really sat down and started to listen analytically to the sound. When you listen to things over and over, week in, week out, then you really start to hear the strengths and weaknesses of things. And that is as true about equipment as it is about music. So that's basically it, really. I think it's difficult for most mastering engineers to single things out. As a whole, I did the albums of a band called the Smiths in the 80s, Rough Trade, the original releases of those albums, which I enjoyed very much because I like music. I've enjoyed doing the surround work for the Beatles, which I started to do in 2007 with Giles Martin. I've enjoyed that very, very much. Doing the Beatles' Love album, Sgt. Pepper's, the White Album, and also people I've worked with, you know, clients that are good clients at the moment, like Pet Shop Boys, Manic Street Preachers, the band Elbow. You know, the relationship I've managed to get with them, really. That's really what it's been based on, is relationships. I mean, the change from analog mastering, which of course was how I learnt in the end of the 70s, it was very straightforward. You cut a 7-inch single or you cut a 12-inch LP. You still had to do a tape for cassette manufacturing in those days. And the formats were all the same. Tapes came in on 1/4-inch tape. You either had the Dolby on or off, and that was about it, really. And then, of course, as time has gone by, you know, tape speeds went from 15 IPS to 30 IPS. And then in the 1980s, you started to see the introduction of digital recording. And nowadays, everything is computer files. Now, that's not as bad as it sounds, actually, because the period before computer files were omnipresent, you had DAC tapes, which I was never particularly crazy about, and all kind of tape-based formats, because they all have got their inherent problems, which can result in errors in the playback. But the modern world that we're in with files, I'm quite happy with, really. I discovered Chord Electronics approximately 25 years ago. I was at a hi-fi show at Heathrow, and I went in the Chord room, and John Franks and I ended up having a conversation together. He told me his background, and I explained to him who I was, and we started chatting and got on like a house on fire. And that was basically it, really. Really, to me, it is just the presentation of music, the way it presents music is what I like about it. It's not just the traditional kind of hi-fi adjectives of the sound stage was wider, the low bass was better, or the top end was more extended. All these things that, you know, you normally use to describe equipment. This is actually much deeper. I'm talking about the actual presentation of the music. If you hear a piano playing, or an acoustic guitar, or a drum kit, it's the actual character of the sound, the way the transients are, and the attack, and the lifelike quality of the reproduction of the sound. That's what's special for me about the DAVE DAC. We've had extremely good quality D2As here for many years, and they're very, very good, and I've compared them over the years to other things that have come along. But when I heard the Dave, it was just something different, has gone up a notch in this piece of equipment. It's almost like the sound within the speakers is different. It's not peripheral things on the edges like soundstage width or extremes of dynamics. It's like the character of the sound is different, and that's what I love about it. The whole question of a D2A converter is tied in, really, to me. It's part, and a very, very important part, of your monitoring system. But not everyone would necessarily agree. They may think some things more important than others. You know, they place more emphasis on one item rather than another. Across the world, there are many, many mastering engineers who prefer to turn the sound back into analog and then process it analog, put it through analog equalizers or analog compressors, and then re-digitize it. That is very, very common. So if you're working like that, the quality of your D2A converter is actually built into your mastering. So if you buy an album that has been mastered like this, a CD, it's actually a recording of the sound of somebody's D2A converter. It's true. It really is. So that puts it into a really, really pivotally important place in the mastering chain. There's two elements to it, really, from a mastering point of view. You know, obviously you want top-notch monitoring so you can hear what you're doing all the time. But if you're processing, you also want top-notch D2A conversion, because that's going to be the part of the sound of your mastering.